Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here on the Conducting Effective Council Meetings webinar, which is part of our governance series of webinars. I'm Spencer Brigham. I'm the Training and Events Administrator for AFOA Canada. And just before we begin, I'd like to read a quick land acknowledgement. So I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the First Nations. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society. We honor the traditional lands and homelands of Indigenous peoples and communities across Canada, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis living both on and off reserve in rural and urban communities. And just a bit about myself, I am Ojibwe background. I'm from Bekedronong First Nation in Ontario, also known as Walpole Island. And without any further ado, I'll hand it over to Harold.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to AFOA Canada's webinar on roles and responsibilities of, running effective council meetings. My name is Harold Tarbell. I'm an Akwesasne Mohawk. My Mohawk name is Sagosquayonto, which means he helps them through their plays, which is in respect to my, essentially, to my career as a meetings helper, as a chair, as chief, and as a professional independent facilitator. I'm joining you from the Squamish Nation territory here in North Vancouver, where I've had the great privilege to live and work for the last few decades. And I do want to also, along with Spencer, extend acknowledgement to the Algonquin Anishinaabe people on whose unceded traditional territory AFOA Canada's head office is located, and to welcome all of you and to acknowledge the territories and traditional territories from which you are joining us today. Your participation, your attendance is greatly appreciated as we pursue these quick 1 hour webinars, which are, sort of a quick oversight in terms of some of those issues that you need to be dealing with. I'll get Spencer to share our PowerPoint, and to just note as we look to get started. We're going to talk a little bit about organizing council meetings, so that reporting and communicating out from meetings themselves, some techniques and some of the knowledge, skills, experience, and attitudes, which, the competencies essentially that you would need to be an effective meeting chair. And then, a little bit on managing some of those challenging topics that may come up, and essentially dealing with the tensions and the delicate topics, and, conflicting views, which, we can often experience. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So let's move to the third slide, if we could. So this next slide is just the agenda that I've just talked to, and then we're going to move into organizing council meetings, and let's go to the next slide as well. So essentially, this is really trying to get you to think about the preparation that you need. So think of it as in terms of preparing, meeting, follow-up. So that's kind of the cycle that this will take, because it's very easy to get caught up in just the meeting itself, but you want to think of it as a part of that cycle. I find that's also a very important to do, because there's a lot of things, a lot of things to synthesize, a lot of things to include, there's a lot of math involved, and I like to joke about conversation math. So given whether it's an information item or a discussion item or a decision item, what's the math involved? And when you look at who's around that table or in that room, what's the back and forth which you need in order to have, inform, our participants are informed, we are able to fully explore an issue, or we are in position to make, well-informed decisions, or as informed decisions as anyone can make at any given time. So, but just in terms of organizing a meeting itself, in terms of the preparation, you want to be thinking about these six 6 pieces: opening and closing, the role of your chair, and in a way, how the chair is going to manage the agenda you're going to set out, the agenda with estimated timeframes. Yeah, I like to tell people it's a matter of division in terms of timeframes for an agenda item, and in terms of also a function of what you're trying to achieve with that agenda item. What's your purpose for that agenda item, which then affects the math and the estimated timeframes. Although I would say, in a general rule, I like to think of an agenda, whether it's a couple hours or especially a full day meeting. I like to think of it in terms of it has its own sort of life cycle, and often there's regular parts of it. So if you think of a council meeting with 2 or 3 meetings, hours long, there's a normal cycle to that. If you think of a full day meeting, I like to design my agendas thinking about that. I've got what I always say, protocol in the first block, right before the coffee break. Protocol, putting the information we need on the table. The next block is then you have that block to lunch. Then you have that block after lunch to the break, and then you have that block after the break to the ending, and that could be a little bit longer, that could be a little shorter, depending on the dynamics. In an online environment, of course, it's been a lot shorter. But that's, so think of those blocks, because that's where it helps to more easily distribute those agendas. And of course, we've all experienced those meetings where, we have this sort of impossible number of items that we want to get through in a meeting. And that's kind of been my life over the last 2 years, that every AFN Special Chiefs Assembly and Annual General Assembly that I've had the difficult privilege of serving as the speaker and chair at, in terms of trying to figure out how to manage all those while being, true to the rules and the roles of the speaker and the chair. So the briefing notes and the band council resolution. So what is the material and how is it organized so that it supports informed decision-making, particularly of our councils? Rules and limitations for presentations and guests. So just know what those are and make sure that they know what those are, and just so that, again, it flows effectively in the meeting. And then minutes and acceptance of minutes. Sort of as a part of that general process, there's sometimes a legal requirement, sometimes it's a Robert's Rules convention that we like to follow. Sometimes we get a little carried away with the formality of that, but just things you got to keep in mind as you're looking to go forward. All right, preparing for the meeting. Let's go to that next slide. So you did see this. It just digs in a little bit in terms of what you saw on the slide previously. I would say an important message in terms of preparing here is as advance notice as possible is critical. So early setting of the location and time of the meeting. Council meetings tend to have their own sort of time. They meet at kind of the same times. They meet, this length. There's a certain convention in terms of how those are happening. It never hurts to kind of write that down so that there's an easier transition to other councils, for example. And again, just making sure that people have enough time before the meeting to reasonably exercise their responsibilities of care and due diligence to, be able to grapple that. And of course, in the council meetings, and depending on the size and scope of our communities, there may be staff specifically assigned to our chief and councils who will, pretty much almost be the production assistant, if you will, in terms of setting that up and running that show, and doing that sort of work there, often in collaboration with the band manager, band administrator, just to again do that interface between the needs of the council and the technical work that's required and the expertise that's required to be brought in. One thing I like to talk about in terms of the agenda, sequencing, supporting documents, but try to think of it in terms of purpose. So what's the purpose of that meeting? And so yes, it's a council meeting, but often, you could have a purpose. There may be a theme. There may be certain things or certain parts of the meeting where in that, normal life cycle of that particular meeting where different things are addressed. But on each of those items, also think about the purpose of it. So I like to put on the agenda, here's the objectives we're trying to achieve in this particular meeting. And on this topic, this is kind of the objective we're trying to, address. And again, one way to look at that is it an information item? Is it a discussion item? Is it a decision making item? And that requires a different calculus of things that go into that work. And as I've noted here, there is each of those information, discussion, decision has a different conversation math. And by the way, just as a rule of thumb, when I think of it, I like to think questions 5 minutes and answers 5 minutes, and that's ideal. We don't often have that much time, and sometimes it's a lot quicker. But just in terms of, you'll see on the agenda, a lot of agendas time for Q&A, and we'll put a few minutes. But it's really you'll know, and when you look at your meetings and watch those meetings, that rule of thumb, so to speak, that those conventions and how long people speak and how long answers take, you'll come up with some rules. I have noted for the chiefs and my work at the Assembly of First Nations that over the years they've become quite effective at being incredibly powerful and persuasive in the 3 and 5 minute time frames. And so, and just as a chair, people sometimes what they'll do is they'll start reiterating their points, and they'll often use different words. And so, as a chair, I try to pay attention to that, so that becomes a nice place for me to sort of interject and sort of move on and use subtle signals to help us manage the time. But we'll touch on that a little bit when we get to the chairing piece itself. As you look at the next one, who needs to be in attendance? I like to refer to this as a critical mass. Who do I need there in order for some have a fair fighting chance to achieve the objective or the purpose for which this meeting or this topic is on the agenda? Sometimes it's about, there's a quorum requirement, and so that becomes sort of the key to, getting the attendance. A lot of times in these meetings, not everyone's there. And so sometimes we wait for everybody, but from a time management point of view, again, I think critical mass, and what does that require, whether it's a formal requirement or a soft requirement. And so sometimes I like to joke, as long as the elders there to get started, and as long as my first couple speakers are there, and if I don't have a quorum, if my quorum is there, or I've got a couple of participants, and it's information, I'm quite prepared to leap in. So just thinking about that, right? And so you'll see some particular people that you'll need. The other one, the subject matter experts are often sort of I don't know, depending on your council, sometimes they'll all sit in. Sometimes they're sort of shuttled in and out as their topic arises. But more often than not, sort of the council staff and band manager, CEO are present throughout, recording staff, that kind of stuff. So those are, let's say there's a sort of starting team, then you're looking at these other places to make sure you're filling in those gaps. Let's go to the next slide in terms of working our way through the meeting. So, of course, I call it the opening protocol because it varies depending on your group. But it is, when we look at the protocol, even in our traditional systems and in our ceremonies, it's often about ensuring that the relationships of the people in the room are clear and that who's doing which work is there. And it's also about being holistic. So whether it's a prayer or a moment of silence or a Thanksgiving address or a song, like there's different ways that it can be done. And if you have the latitude to try different things, and sometimes those create different tone for the meetings. So you do want to think about that. But generally, when we talk about a prayer, because there can be a religious nature to that. From a chair's point of view, it tends to be sort of, I think it's ecumenical is the word I'm looking for, in terms of all things are good for me, whether it's a prayer or a ceremony or a song, or sometimes I've actually seen even performances as opening protocol. But that, it is really about sort of giving us a moment to sort of ground ourselves and giving us a moment to reflect. And really, in some ways, prayers and protocol remind us of why we are there. So just, it can be quite powerful, as opposed to sometimes it becomes a pro forma thing that we do. And I like to sort of always try to remind myself to, pay attention to that particular piece. All right, next slide. Right. So again, there's opening protocol and there's also closing protocol, but there's also the formal opening of the meeting. Generally, in these sort of board functions and council meetings, we go through this, Robert's rules kind of thing, or sometimes legally required, or sometimes it's our convention, but we make a motion to adopt the agenda and we make a motion to adjourn the meeting. I would just say that it's one parliamentarian that I work with, who's essentially an expert in this, Ellie Minna here in Vancouver. He basically says sometimes we overuse the motions. So sometimes we make a motion to adopt a report, or we do things in principle. And he's like, sometimes I question the value of that, or the necessity of that. And again, at that point, I would, not being a lawyer, but having served as a chair and being trained as a facilitator and having been a chief, I'm cognizant of that field, but in some respects, you do need to double check what do your policies, procedures, your charter, your bylaws, your constitution, what do they say about that? And so you just gotta be careful, because in the end, what that's about is can this be challenged, and do you get into a parliamentary wrangling piece at this point? One thing I do like to say about this is that Robert's Rules of Order. Robert's Rules of Order is often quite misunderstood, and that most of us, and I say this as start out as jailhouse parliamentarians. We just learned from the people that we were around or the group that we were in, and we were told it was Robert's Rules, but almost very few of us have actually taken that training about Robert's Rules and what is actually required and what is just helpful. In the end, many of us grow up and learn that Robert's Rules is used to control and manipulate the outcome of an agenda or a discussion. But in reality, Robert's Rules is intended to create a fair and open and efficient and effective process which allows participants to make as informed decisions as possible. So when you look at it as the meeting's helper, it's a different way than looking at it as the meeting's sledgehammer. And that's an important distinction to keep in mind. And so just be clear about whether this is a pro forma motions or whether this is a legally required motion, or if this is just, in any way, sometimes it's a good practice, can be done by consensus as well. And we do a lot of that adoption, sort of the most agreement possible to deal with an issue. I don't think consensus comes up in here. It may, but we'll talk a little briefly about that. One thing about consensus and more formal consensus process is that versus a vote or a motion where it's an up and down vote, a consensus says, yes, there may be some outstanding issues, and we agree as a group that we're actually going to allow ourselves to come back to that, but not in such a way where it's going to undermine our decision to move forward. So, which is a little bit different than how we see Robert's Rules of Order being done. All right, let's look at the next one. And so this is one of those areas, which comes up a lot. What is in camera? When should it be used? And how do we go about it? So here, a meeting can go into camera when dealing with private and confidential information. Often the agenda then records that we went into camera and we came back out of camera, and public, then you start the recording. To me, what's important, and I do recommend this, is that it's important to have a policy and a procedure about in camera. So what are the private and confidential matters that could be talked about in an in-camera session? So a lot of times people go in to talk about financial matters, and that raises some concerns. If all your financial discussions are in question or in camera, that raises questions of transparency and accountability. So sometimes what I often see too is people use in camera because they want to talk about things that are sensitive or where they know we're going to have a lot of political maneuvering, but they're not really confidential or private. And so you do see that a lot. I've seen situations where in camera has been used to basically exclude certain people from a meeting, not because there was any kind of conflict of interest, but because we wanted to not let them have a vote. I've actually seen meetings where in camera has been tried to use, in fact, to exclude the chief from a meeting. And again, because if there's no policy or procedure that's there, well defined, you are sort of moving back and forth. You would build that based upon your conventions and so the norms that you already have in place for that. And so I think that's pretty critical. The other side of this that you got to be really aware of is decision making. So I've seen the practice and the policy where you can make a decision in camera, but you must report the decision once you come out of in camera. So I've done that in a few meetings. I've also been in a situation where the policy has been, and it's been described as a legal requirement. Again, I'm not positive on that, where you can't make decisions in camera. You can have the debate, but when it comes to the vote, you must do that in public. And so again, to me, that just emphasizes the need to have a policy and a procedure for your in-camera process. Next one, we're going to just move rather quickly to recording and communicating the meeting. And so again, there is varying degrees of minutes. I'll just respond. I see a note there. I could build it in. Is there a sample of an in-camera policy? Yeah, I've seen some online, like again, just search online. I do know that the AFN Yukon has an in-camera policy, which has been very helpful for them. And so there are groups who do have that. So that's a good place to look at that. Should your CEO and your director of operations be part of the in-camera? In my view, yes. And again, unless it's about some sense, not sensitive issue, but private and confidential matter, which for privacy and confidentiality issue reasons, the CEO or senior manager wouldn't be involved in that. And again, that's one of those areas you can define and clarify in a policy. And sometimes that's a policy decision that the chief and council need to make. There may be case law on it, I don't know. But again, as you do the research on that, think of it as another planning process. There's an issue we need to address. There's a certain context currently that we have, and we want to understand that. We then need to, really burrow down on the key issues that need to be resolved in terms of addressing the in-camera policy or in-camera situation. Then we're going to come up with some options and some things, and then we're going to get the council to make a decision. Maybe there's a recommendation in there about that, and we're going to put that in place, and then we're going to pay attention to that as we try and see how it works, and be open to the fact that we can in fact change that policy, assess its effectiveness, and change it where necessary. So yeah, so again, just to let me say this, can you provide clarity? You can make a decision in favor in camera, but be against it out of camera. Just allow the item to move forward. Okay, so yeah, in that one, it sounds more like you're talking about the politics of an in-camera. And so sometimes that's another reason to use in-camera, because I don't want people to know how I'm voting on that particular issue, but then I can come out and, still present myself as being, the champion of an issue even though I voted in a different way. So that might be a little bit more of a political dynamic there. What I was trying to get at was, again, this issue about where the decision gets made. Is it made in camera or outside of camera? Yeah, and that piece you're talking about, I'm not sure if Robert's Rules has a rule on that or a guideline. That could be pretty detailed in terms of digging into Robert's Rules. So yeah, I'll just kind of leave that there. Let's go to the next
We
slide
have
here.
one more question here in the Q&A from
Oh,
Sheila Howard. Is there any examples of dealing with management on a council level when the in-camera discussion is in regards to the, quote, band manager? Who do you direct to do this work?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think if I've been in that particular situation or if I know of any resources. That is the awkward one. You do have that dynamic where the council is the supervisor of the senior official, right? Or the board is the supervisor of the CEO. Again, I think it would come down to the nature of the issue and not having, let's say, a clear answer on that. I would say let's put that in the policy and let's at least propose something in the policy for the council and the board to pick, because in some respect that could be a habit, and you've got this collection of people who come together with different interests and experiences in particular, or skill sets around governance or board operations, and so there are often quite a few different interpretations of what it could be, and so sometimes it's important to let that collective do that, and then in some ways just put your finger on the issue, and as we say in training, let the group sit in its own stuff for a while to figure out how it's going to solve it. So you can, again, think of that policy development planning process where you're providing them the key issues to be addressed and the options there. So that's the best I can do for you, Sheila. I don't, again, have a clear example of that, but I would think it has to be really careful about that. Chatham House Rules is an interesting one, and that one is the idea that you can what you talk about. It's actually Chatham House Rule. There's only one rule: you can't attribute anything, or you can't talk about what happens in that session. So that's rule, and there's a little bit of online stuff about how that works in that kind of context. Yeah, you want to just be really careful. So there's that issue of confidentiality, right? And almost like compliance. Do you really have the ability to enforce confidentiality and compliance with the Chatham House Rules? And so you really want to be careful about that. So for lack of a better word, the post-discussion enforcement of that. The other part I would say is that there's a rule in policy governance of a board when you look at it in terms of communication, is that basically what it says in nicer words is have the debate either publicly or in camera as a board or as a council. Whatever that decision is, there's an obligation in effect, a moral obligation, a duty obligation almost, a loyalty obligation to all sing from the same sound sheet. Now, again, in our governance, in our politics, and in our government, that doesn't always happen, but that is the policy governance sort of norm that, yes, if you're operating as a collective, then you speak as a collective, and then often it is the role of the chief or a designated person designated by the collective to speak on that issue. And so that's another board mechanism that would connect to the sort of the in-camera transition and the confidentiality piece, but you just got to be careful there. To me, I say be realistic about it, and recognize sometimes things don't go as nicely as it says in our rules and procedures. But from a facilitator chair point of view, sometimes I'm less focused on the letter of the law or the policy or procedure as opposed to the intention of it and ensuring that we're being respectful that way. There is a connection to the minutes in terms of what gets recorded. And so that's another area where an in-camera decision can get recorded in the meeting. In-camera is something that can get overused a lot, particularly where where our politics are intense, or where our reaction to change, or interpersonal relationships can happen. But sometimes that can get overused a little bit there. And so sometimes it's important to just, again, put your finger on what those issues are versus, and maybe they're not in-camera policy and procedure issues. They are other issues which could be treated as professional development needs rather than any great moral failing of anyone. And work can be done to build up our knowledge, skills, experience, and attitudes in that area, our competencies. So this one here basically says, what you're looking for in the minutes of a council meeting. And make it as relevant to the reader as possible. I think there's, decisions to be made in terms of the depth of the minute. So the verbatims, the he said, she said version, the summaries, the record of decisions, very brief, action items, like those kinds of things. You'll see them in all different shapes and forms. Often what I do from a chair's point of view is there may be a requirement for a certain type. The other one is you're kind of looking at what is it you need to have, as I said, the most, from a, the best informed decision or outcome, and the best implementation of that discussion and decision following the meeting. So that can define what you need in there. There's a process for that. The Roberts rules kind of thing in terms of when you get the formal decisions, whether you use Roberts rules like that or you use something else, you do want to have some sort of a formal process so that there is that. So even if it's a consensus process, you want to go through some ceremony, which basically says we are making a decision, and this is the decision we are making, and we are mostly in agreement that there's some outstanding issues, or it's a vote up and down. So whatever that procedure is, and it could be varied, and there's a couple different ways to go at that. Yeah, there is a procedure that people do where when you're speaking, they'll look it up, and oftentimes in the rules, it's a requirement that you must state whether you're speaking for or against. As a chair, you can actually say, well, we're hearing a lot of people for it. Let's hear some other perspectives. You can go search for that. You have a bit of latitude there. We'll talk a little bit about the distinction between the elected chair and an independent chair. So that's gives it just different layers of latitude and perception there as well. And abstaining from a motion, there's this thing about recording the abstentions, which some people do it and some people don't. And I haven't looked lately at the rules about that. But again, it's it doesn't seem to have undermined democracy by recording it or not recording it. There is in the AFN, we have a rule about if it comes to a vote and to have the vote threshold in doing that math, the abstentions are not counted. So just again, just being familiar and aware of what your convention, policy, procedure, or legal requirement is relative to that. Again, when you get to the motions or to the minutes, fairly brief, I think is better. On politically contentious ones, there's a bit of an art to it in terms of stating those issues and capturing that conversation in such a way, because it can be quite the flashpoint. So you got to be, there's some art involved in that piece there, some diplomacy necessary. And then at some point, you do need those accepted in one way, shape, or form. Chief and counsel often kind of do it as a, very formally, like that in terms of both decisions and previous minutes, which are again part of our often the logistical opening protocol and the openings of some meetings is to do that. And I've done it in a variety of different ways. I haven't chaired a lot of chief meetings, but I've chaired a lot of political governance meetings. And again, we do it in a variety of different ways. Committee meetings a little bit different, and they're often a lot more relaxed about the procedures, as long as there's essentially some level of agreement that the minutes do reflect the reality of that. It can be a political issue in terms of the structure, but that's the political realities of our council meetings. On verbatims, I've actually never seen them used. Really, where verbatims are used is when we actually it gets to the dysfunctional level of where we've gone to court against each other, and we want to use some of those as evidence. The other where verbatims come in is where we kind of have a tension point or a conflict, a differing of opinion or position, and we're trying to, we're advocating for our position, and sometimes we like to go back and find the verbatims and use them against the other person to say that they actually agreed with us when they may be taking a different position at the moment. So I'm not a big fan of the verbatims personally. All right, let's look at the next one. So again, the whole piece. What's your formal procedure for the adoption of the previous minutes? Signed off after review and editing to be the official record. Is it a motion? Is it a collective decision to adopt them? And then often what happens is, I would say it's in that order: review, fix where necessary, accept, sign. Is what it then really depends on the group who signs those off to make them official. Yeah, draft resolutions for presentation. Who determines that? Yeah, that's an interesting one. It's up to, and it works different ways in different communities. Oftentimes, the general rule on a resolution is you want it drafted and you want it in the hands of the decision makers as early as possible so that it can be an informed decision. Drafting on the fly is done a lot. It's not, again, ideal, but as long as, again, you're clear about the wording and you're translating as quickly into writing, that's important. But there's often a procedure for that. Generally, that's a bit of a technical work. There's also a distinction between resolutions and motions. So resolutions often refer to those written versions, pre-distributed, pre-developed, which have a chance to be sort of worked on and shaped, and that kind of stuff prior to the meeting. Motions often happen on the floor or at the time or on the fly. Ideally, you want to try to keep the distinction of substantive content decisions over here, procedural on the resolution side, procedural matters on the motion side. But a lot of times the convention is, and I've seen that happen a lot, that motions are used as resolutions for substantive matters. That can happen. Errors or mistakes from the minutes. Yeah, they're easily corrected. It's, you just got to do that democratically, so to speak. Minor editing, I wouldn't worry about too much, like, dotting our I's, crossing our T's. Changes of content, changes of meaning, that's where I would actually make sure that is a recommended change, and it's just brought back to the next meeting. If it's like fundamental change, then I would even reconsider that, bringing that back as an agenda item in terms of that particular item. The other distinction you want to make is that the meeting minutes are about what happened. And so a lot of times I do see political bodies and other bodies get into debates about what's in the minutes because they didn't state their position well, or it didn't go the way they wanted to, or they're trying to influence how implementation is happening or going to happen by changing what's in the minutes. And so again, you just got to be a little bit aware of that. And that's a bit of procedural and sharing, technical function that you'll do there. But like I said, sometimes it can be quite simple. Sometimes you just need to be really conscientious. And it depends on what's at stake, I guess is the way I would describe that. All right. Yeah, just after the process, again, I think connected to this last couple of questions is our next slide, which is about sort of the legality of it and where that can play out. Legality in its construction, legality in its formalization, and legalities following later. Yeah, video recordings are, of course, often done. We see them in Zoom a lot. It's always good to have a policy about whether you're going to release that raw footage. Most people I know don't release the raw footage. They focus on the formal approved notes. Because again, by the way, if you've ever read the transcript of like a verbatim transcript, which have not been cleaned up, and by the way, which take hours to clean up, to take out all the ers and ums and ahs, and half sentences, and tie that all together, and diversions in our conversation, like all of those conversational patterns that we have. That's an extensive amount of effort on that. And so, there is an issue about whether they should be made public or not. What I'll often say is they are there to help us to make sure we construct the appropriate minutes for this particular group, and that's kind of what we're trying to get at. Yeah, so we have permission. So here, this is a little different situation, but you gave us permission to run. Zoom's funny in the sense of do I have permission to record you, or well, if I don't, then leave the meeting. We got to be a little bit more. I like to try to be a little bit more democratic than that, but technology. All right, let's. The last slide in this section is communicating action items, and so again, that's the follow-up. And so what is that interface? And so, again, there's follow-up. Chief and council got to do some stuff. To the degree that they're available, the supports to the chief and council, that component of our program, of our administration, needs to do some follow-up. There's follow-up which needs to happen with the administration and the programs. And then how is that going to be communicated out? And how is that going to be followed up on? And there's also, the legal counsels, the auditor, the bank, the funders. There's the other experts that we're involving. There's a connection to them as well. And so just making sure that that's clear how that's going to happen. That's really what we're trying to get at here, right? Again, the group that's let's say the logistical backbone of that council meeting is really doing the technical piece of that. Chiefs and councilors, of course, are then managing that in their own leadership ways and with their own leadership styles. Some quite active in that process. Others pretty laissez-faire, standoffish to that process. And just looking to make sure that the agendas are moving forward. Again, there's all key focal points. The executive assistant, the band manager, the executive director, they're often key contact points. Often in our structures, councils have a number of direct reports. And so that's the other main avenue where you would go. So direct reports, more so that CEO suite of so the financial officer might be a direct report. Communications might be a direct report. The senior administrative officer might be a direct report. That kind of stuff. And so we see a variety of different ways of how do we update that, how do we monitor that, how do we communicate that to the chief and the council as a collective. And we see that in informal and formal ways, but there should be some mechanism to do that. I would try to get to the point where when you got everybody looking at it more as an issue of efficiency and an opportunity for continuous improvement rather than a blame game about who's to blame for something not happening. Like that, if we can get away from that, I think we'd be yeah. Okay. Thanks, Vicky. I appreciate your sharing that that observation as well. All right, let's move to our next agenda item. And I think we have about 15 minutes left. So effective meeting chair. Next slide, an effective chair is essential to running a good meeting process. So the duties of chair on the next slide. And so there's an acronym called OFEEDS, OFEEDS, which chairs learn a lot. And when you take training on how to run an effective meeting, you'll come across this. It's order, focus, efficiency, equality, decorum, and safety. So order, focus, efficiency, equality, decorum, safety. Easy to Google. You'll get the detailed descriptions. But just, so again, order and focus, are we conducting ourselves in good order? Are we proceeding in good order? Focus, are we on topic? Is generally that, are we remembering that it's an information, an exploratory discussion or a decision? Are we addressing the issues that are there? And, as opposed to getting, the one line I heard a great leader say one time is, are we remembering we are hunting for bear, or are we distracted by the rabbit tracks? And so just, again, focus. Efficiency is, so, is there good distribution? Are we, are we efficient? Equality, that's more about participation, so more equity. Is everybody, are we hearing the voices? Are we, making sure we're hearing all sides of the discussion? That kind of decorum. So again, just being respectful. By the way, that's one of those reasons you see a lot of meetings where they address the chair. And sometimes we look at that as a great respect to the chair, but in fact, the purpose of addressing the chair is to depersonalize the issue. It's so that I don't say, well, Bob said this. What I say is, Mr. Chair, I'd like to speak to this point, about this, and, try to learn how to not say, and Bob said this. Again, try to dig for that issue. But that's kind of why you'll see a lot of that formality. Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker. You'll see a lot of that in our meetings. Chief, National Chief, you hear that a lot. But in some respect, that's the purpose of it. And so, kind of you can see how it then feeds into those. The other one I'll talk about is safety of the persons, right? So not from personal attack, for example, but safety of the ideas, the ability to, in fact, know how you got to, you're trying to create a safe place for dialogue, and that's the rule. What I suggest the chief is the chair. What does the chair bring for items? Yes, so there's quite a lot on that. I've got, I would say two things. Sometimes it's mandated that they're the chair, and they're fairly good about being the chair. I would say you want to be really clear about the distinction between process, the running of the meeting, OFEEDS, and content, what we came to talk about and what the decision's going to be. And so often that then gets to where you get into the dynamic. As a professional facilitator, I often encourage a separate chair. You'll see a lot of councils they will assign the chair to their members, or you can bring in an independent chair, or at least a chair that is seen to be objective. And I think that's the other piece about from a facilitator's point of view. And so we need to know the difference between process and content, because as an independent chair, we are more responsible for process. What I say about the AFN is, like when I do that meeting, is I'm the speaker. I'm responsible for process. And basically the rules say order and decorum is my responsibility. I said, in a funny way, I don't care what you decide on the resolution. Personally, I deeply care. But as a chair, my job is not to care. My job is to make sure that a well-informed democratic decision is made on that. And, that's my process. Of course, I deeply believe in the AFN, in those resolutions and in many of these topics and decisions. But from a chair's perspective, I got to find a way to create some objectivity. So that's the dynamic you want to be looking at. And again, that's a good discussion to have. Oftentimes, chiefs and chairs have a hard time letting that go. But what it does do is it frees them up to engage in the dialogue more effectively. I've in fact, even as a professional facilitator, when I was a program director, tried to chair in that context, and nobody would believe in my objectivity. Everybody knew I was a good facilitator, but I was the director, and so they just could not inherently accept that I was prepared to be objective and that I didn't have an agenda. It's worth trying and talking about. I would say the majority of times where I have stepped in for chiefs and elected chairs, they have appreciated it in terms of the ability to get to the issues, to get the decisions, to run the process more efficiently. But again, that's a learning curve. By the way, I just want to make sure we go back that one slide for Louise, as she's noted it. Yeah, and so and then on that question you just asked, that is in fact the next slide, which talks about it. And I've just sort of addressed that, the effective meeting chair. So that when we're ready to move forward, we'll start moving into the very quick on the politically charged topic. So by the way, on politically charged topics, there's no shortage of them. We're going to give you some examples here. So here's the one about, is it important to get in a separate chair? I noticed I'm not mentioned in the alternatives or facilitators are not mentioned. But yeah, so that's there. And then the next one gets us into these difficult topics. And there's a lot of those. We've given you a few examples. So some big ticket items where you could see where there's difference of opinion, where there's tension points. You probably are remembering some environments where we've had to deal with those and the drama of that. Bottom line on this is really take some conflict management training, and in the end, what it tells you is get comfortable. Your ability to navigate tension points, delicate issues, as I like to call them, conflicts in the meeting, really comes down to your comfort with being in a tense situation, or your comfort with conflict, as odd as that is to say. When you take the training, they will say conflict is a healthy thing if there's processes and procedures by which you can deal with it and there's outlets for it, versus unresolved conflict, which just digs into and becomes traumatic in its own way. And so that's pretty critical here. It's kind of like pick your poison here in terms of which one that is. Taxation, enforcement, another one. But in many ways, sometimes these controversial issues are the core functions of government and governance and administration and program delivery. And that's where that conflict comes up with. So just think, and it's also important to think your way through that. We've got some solutions on the next page. Some of those basically, these are time-honored work one, on the soft end, and on the really reminding us that we're all here, and even though we disagree, we can disagree agreeably. Elders like to talk about hard words for the issues, soft words for the people. So use those. Ceremony, protocol, ceremony to help you navigate through tension points and conflict. All very critical in our context. Again, on the more harder enforcement end, have special security officers in the meeting. By the way, the AFN, I had the authority when I'm the speaker to throw people out of the meeting. I have never thrown people out of the meeting. I like to remind people of the rules. that I can do that, but I've never done that. I've never found it. I always say people come to a meeting to say something, and you are better off letting them say it. And because until they say it, they're not going to listen to anything else. And anything you ask them, they're going to say what they came to say. In my tribe, the chiefs have switched the order. They do new business first at the monthly meeting, and they put a time limit of 45 minutes on it. And what they realized was new business is often at the end of the meeting when you look at the standard agenda formats. And what they realized was that people were using new business to bring up the controversial tension issues. And because it was at the end, they were just waiting and they weren't listening, they weren't hearing. So they switched it over. And then, by the way, it was at the end of the meeting, so they would always try to make it longer. Switch it up. We still have, contentious meetings, but they're contained. And then what often happens is once heard, and they feel like they've been heard, those people who have the contentious often sit back or leave. And then you still get to that. And then if they've been heard and they sit back, they then are in a position, their minds are now clear to hear and to learn. So, so that's another dynamic that we often see are dealing with. The last thing I'll say here is we do want to provide support. Be prepared to provide support for that. Not only supports in terms of navigating and putting your finger on the issue and being prepared to do that. So, looking at a problem-solving process, what's the issue being expressed? Let's clarify to make sure we know what the underlying issue is that we really need to be talking about. Let's be creative in our conversation in terms of learning about it and thinking about our ways out. Try not to get into either or dynamics. You got to agree with me, you don't got to disagree with me. Try to find those creative options. In my belief, when you do creative problem solving, they say, come up with at least 3 solutions. And to me, that's on purpose to get away from either or, because either or is easy in some ways. So you want to do that. Even as a participant, as a chief in a council, I've actually heard of people who really needed those supports after the meeting because these tension points can be quite traumatic, can be quite triggering for all parties involved, and we really don't know how that's going to be there. So be prepared during the meeting with supports and after the meeting. When I used to work with a healing organization, we would often talk about after our conferences, be prepared for unexpected and unwanted feelings, which will come up as we looked at our healing journey. And so that, so in the middle of nowhere, that would show up. And so sometimes I would act out, and then people would remind me of where that came from, and then I could properly process it. Norms, great for it, as long as in community agreements, it's a great tool, not a perfect tool, but it does help to maintain order, focus, respect in a meeting. Off ramps, try to have some off ramps for it. Like people talk about the parking lot, but sometimes like the writing down parking lot, not step out in the parking lot. People talk about that a little bit, but it's really about off ramps. And so if you're going to put it over there, like even in consensus, there's still outstanding issues. Make sure there's a process to come back to it to deal with it. Otherwise, it just festers and it interferes with the ability to move forward. If you're trying to de-escalate, I talk a lot about the importance of a strategic break because it doesn't always have to be at the table. It doesn't have to be on the floor. Sometimes you can have those side conversations and just brief things just to clarify what's going on. Calm, bring some calm to that. Shift the conversation. Lots of little things you can do to sort of break that stream. And speakers will often get into a bit of a stream of consciousness. And so sometimes I do the thing as a facilitator, which I become distracting, which basically as a facilitator, they say, don't do that. But sometimes you need to sort of gently disrupt people. And, by the way, the nicest, kindest thing you can do to do that is bring somebody a glass of water. So lots of different techniques which you can use there as well. And I think, where are we on our slides? I know we're almost out of time. Oh, the last thing I'll just show you, if you want to show my slide. By the way, in terms of designing a meeting, this is from the Grove International in San Francisco. It often has the Grove copyright on it. It didn't show up on this one, but it's a nice little agenda startup. I commissioned them to do it differently. It used to be a raft. I put some West Coast people in there. but just trying to think about the design of the meeting. You need an agenda, you need to know the rules, you need to know the norms, you need to think about the purpose of this meeting and what it's supposed to achieve. And this helps you do that. Anybody who's from the West Coast will immediately point out this boat's going to tip over because in the big canoes, you all have to have your oars in the water at the same time. The original one was a raft, and so they were and by the way, they also don't go in rivers. But I like it as a metaphor for the turbulence of a meeting and of a group. And so sometimes we're not aligned and coordinated. We don't have our oars, we're not all going in the right direction. So this is a nice little tool that's available, and you can go to the Grove facilitation to get the original, although, you know, you're welcome to steal this one as well. It's just called Tarbell Meeting Card Setup because I commissioned that little change there, but you know, it's not that copyrighted. All right, guys, I think we're at the time. Once again, I've managed to talk my way through time. Lisa, we were able to get the questions in, so I do appreciate that. I'm going to turn you over to Spencer.
Yep. Thank you so much, Harold, for facilitating this session on conducting effective council meetings. And thank you to everyone for attending today. So we are ending the webinar now. If you are attending our third and fourth webinar, those will be shortly. But if not, thank you so much for attending.